you. So I was requested to write a personal column about the work that I do, because usually my work is very technical as when we report human rights violations. So I would like to dedicate this column to every single Palestinian refugee who has suffered for the past 66 years. On the 27th of December 2008 at 11:30 a.m., Israel launched one of its most inhumane and brutal attacks on the Gaza Strip. An operation that would last 21 days and cost the lives of more than 1,400 Palestinians. On that morning at 11:30 a.m., with the first Israeli airstrike that killed 108 people on the spot, I saw my cousin being blown apart on live television. It was a one-sided war that was filmed, and we were the targets and the audience. At the funeral, at a moment of anger and despair, I looked at my grandfather and blamed him for everything. At that moment, I blamed him for the murder of my cousin, because he fled. He fled Jaffa, he fled our town, and because of him, and because his coward behavior at that moment, we became refugees in the Gaza Strip. Of course, I realized that my words to him were severely harsh and unfair, but it was my pain talking. The pain of seeing Gaza, my Gaza, being blown apart by a heartless war machine that has no mercy. At the end of the Israeli military operation, 75% of Gaza's infrastructure was demolished. I say my Gaza, because that is the only part of Palestine that I was allowed to be in. It is the only part of Palestine that I know, even though my blue UN refugee card tells me every single time that I'm not from Gaza. It reminds me that I'm from another city, the city of Jaffa, located some 70 kilometers away from my refugee camp. In fact, all 1.1 million refugees in the Gaza Strip reside less than 70 kilometers away from their cities. A system of Israeli apartheid is what is keeping them away in their refugee camps. Growing up, I could hardly cope with the idea that my grandfather left our home in Jaffa. It's a thought that has always haunted me. Even though I carry the legacy of the Nakba, I know exactly what happened to my family. I have the exact directions of our home in Jaffa. I have even Googled Earth it and took a print screen of it. So I know it exists, but I cannot accept it. Last June, the remains of dozens of Palestinians killed in the cities of Jaffa during the 1948 war were discovered in a mass grave. The skeletons, which filled 6 chambers, were hastily buried together during one of the most horrifying ethnic cleansing operations that modern history has witnessed. When I close my eyes, I try to glimpse a part of what my grandfather and that of other Palestinians' grandparents had to witness. I only see the black and white pictures of the Nakba that I have found online. But my work for the past 3 years has changed my entire perception of the Nakba. It has changed it from being part of our collective memory and turned it into reality. By watching what is happening in Syria and witnessing live on television screens how a country is turned into pieces in no time, and how millions and millions of people are fleeing a devastating war, terror, persecution and death, I finally gave the Nakba a place. It made me realize even more that the Nakba is a harsh, continuous reality that started 60 years ago until this day. It has not known one moment of rest. For the past 3 years, I have been monitoring and documenting the second and third exodus of Palestinian refugees, leaving and fleeing their homes in Syria. I have been to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, and most recently, since last year, to Sicily and Malta, where we had to receive the bodies of those drowned in the Mediterranean, hoping that they would reach Europe after all their other attempts for dignity in neighboring countries have failed. The Palestinian refugees in Syria are the personification of the ongoing Nakba. For more than 40 years, the governments of Hafez al-Assad and his son Bashar al-Assad claimed to be protectors of Palestinian refugees. Nonetheless, in the course of the Syrian crisis, government forces did not refrain from shelling Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, where rebel forces had infiltrated with virtually all residential areas, experiencing armed engagement or the use of heavy weapons or starvation as a weapon of war. UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, has stated that more than 70% of the 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria are in need of emergency humanitarian assistance, while more than 50% are internally displaced. As a result, thousands of terrified Palestinian families, along with Syrians, have fled to safety with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They left for countries with established refugee camps for Syrians, such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. However, unlike the rest of the Syrian population, this was not Palestinian refugees' first exodus. It was, for some Palestinians, their second or third displacement since their initial expulsion from Palestine in 1948. The most vulnerable refugee group in the Middle East, Palestinian refugees, have been caught in a limbo of regional politics and the blind spots of international law. Jordanian authorities, for instance, and other neighboring countries welcome Syrian refugees. Unfortunately, Palestinians from Syria were not welcome. Jordan, for instance, has adopted and enforced the policy of non-entry to all Palestinian refugees fleeing the Syrian conflict, aggravating the extreme vulnerability of Palestinians seeking safety in that country. Jordanian authorities have been known to deport back to Syria Palestinian refugees who have managed to enter Jordan, robbing them of their right to survival. Such a policy violates the international law principle of non-refoulement, which protects refugees from being sent back to places where their lives or freedoms could be threatened. Most recently, Palestinians fleeing the besieged refugee camp in Yarmouk and Darha were turned back at the Jordanian border. Unfortunately, Egypt is applying the same policy. For me, as a professional who had to document and monitor violation Palestinian refugees from Syria are subjected to, I have seen families hiding from Arab security forces, using false identification cards, hiding their Palestinian identity in fear of deportation. Sadly, they are not even being deported back to their country of origin. Once, in a 2-bedroom house where 4 families were hiding, Lu'ay, a 5-year-old child, answered my question as I was documenting what was happening with his family. My question was, "Where are you from?" And with innocence he replied, "I'm from Palestine." At that same moment, his father, his desperate father, grabbed him from his shoulder and yelled at him, "Didn't I tell you to answer this question with 'I am Syrian'?" I calmed the desperate father down and told him, "Don't worry, I am Palestinian too." I have witnessed Palestinian refugees suffering severely from amputation and shrapnel wounds. I have visited orphaned infants, traumatized children, and victims of life-threatening diseases such as cancer, who were left to die because of high treatment costs. The most prevalent cases of human suffering were due to extreme poverty, as fathers had no money to feed their wives or children. We absorbed one story after the other, one misery after the other, witnessing so much pain that at the end of the day, one could hardly breathe from despair. But maybe in these 3 years of ongoing Nakba for the Palestinian Syrian refugees, the most excruciating pain I have felt was in October 2013, when I was asked to fly to Sicily in Italy and identify the bodies of 35 Palestinian refugees who have drowned in the Mediterranean. They were among at least 400 other Palestinian and Syrian refugees in a boat that capsized a few miles before the Italian shore. Only 190 people survived, the rest are still missing, and 35 bodies were recovered. As I set foot in Sicily and saw people in shock, crying in despair, searching for their beloved ones in a country foreign to them, with absolutely no one to support them or help them, they were abandoned, and they, to me, personified the Palestinian cause. Unlike us in Gaza, when Israel strikes, we have each other. We mourn together, we hold each other's hands, we cope together, we heal together. But these people in Sicily, these refugees, had no one. There was no one for them, not a government to ask about them, not an organization, no one. They were invisible, just like the numbers under which the Italian government had buried the bodies. Spread all over Sicily, bodies 1 to 28 can be found in unnamed graves. And with every Palestinian refugee that dies, I blame Israel completely. Palestinian refugees in Syria lived their entire lives less than 100 kilometers away from their homes, from their hometowns in Palestine. If Israel had respected international law and allowed them to go back, they would have still been alive. Instead, they fled from Syria to Lebanon, from Lebanon to Egypt, from Egypt to Libya, and from Libya they died in the Mediterranean. Their death was unnecessary. But in this very sad story, between the lines is the story of heroes, of men and women and children who have been facing with their bare bodies and resilience the most despicable colonial entity in modern history and the most despicable complicit silence of the international community. We, as Palestinians and as refugees, have stood up to injustice with grace and power and love. It takes lots of courage and faith to wake up every single day and decide to continue and not to give up. Maybe you can perceive lots of frustration in what I'm saying, but this is simply the tone that characterizes the agony of our reality. However, what keeps us going is much bigger than all this. It's hope. The Arab Revolution took place at times we had almost lost hope, and they are still ongoing despite the setbacks. The message of the Arab youth was humane. It demanded basic human rights, and among their demands, the Palestinian cause was present. And since decades, the Palestinian flag was waving with pride in every single capital of the Arab Spring, demanding justice to Palestinians and their refugees. I took part of demonstrations in Egypt, organized by Egyptian youth, demanding their governments to welcome Palestinian refugees and to demand the right of return to their homeland and to pressure Israel. Because no one on this earth is entitled to give up the right of return of Palestinian refugees, even if it's their own government who claims to represent them. Waves of support were organized in the Arab world to alleviate the suffering of the refugees. Even here, in the Netherlands, lots of young men and women are putting time and effort to raise awareness campaigns and supply humanitarian assistance in support of our people's second misfortune. Our demands are humane, and that's why humanity can relate to it. If the people's will is to live, then fate will have to obey. Last night, I dropped at the train station here in Amsterdam Central Station 2 young Palestinian families from the Yarmouk camp in Syria. They made it safely to Holland and survived the boat journey to Europe with their young children a while ago. And despite their heartache, last night they insisted on taking the train to Paris to attend the 12th annual conference for Palestinians in Europe. Today, right now, as we speak, under the slogan "A United Palestine for the Promise of Return," generations of Palestinians in Europe and their aspiration of a free Palestine are coming together from Holland, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, Romania, Spain, Germany, and other countries in the European Union, including Palestinian refugees from Syria, to affirm their right of return. Because, no matter how long it takes for justice to prevail, someday soon we will return. Thank you.